Hello everyone, and welcome to my 2021 Absolute Beginner's Guide to Building a Gaming PC. Now even though this is an Absolute Beginner's Guide, don't worry if you have a little bit of experience, we're going to have timestamps down below, so if you need to jump past the part that you already know, or if you need to go and rewatch a section, you can just click one of those timestamps and you'll be good to go. Now, this is just a PC build guide. For a parts guide, because 2021 has been so hectic with availability, I'm going to suggest that you join our Discord down in the description below, and me or one of the mods there will be more than happy to help you out with advising you on what parts to get, because prices have been so crazy right now that it changes from week to week. Now, the number one thing to keep in mind when building a PC is just to be a bit relaxed with it. You know, you don't have to rush, take your time and go at your own pace. You know, if it takes you a little bit longer to build a PC than some of the people that you see on YouTube or some of your friends, that's fine. People need to work at their own pace. You're naturally going to be a bit stressed out and a bit apprehensive of building a PC. There are expensive parts in there and you don't want to break them. But most of these parts are fairly durable. You can set them around and flop them around and they'll usually be fine, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And just enjoy it like you're building a little set of Legos. It can be very fun and very relaxing. It's why I do it as a hobby and why I want to do it as a career in IT. So, with that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and go over my parts list for the build, and then we're going to get started. So I'm going to be using parts that you can actually find in stock in 2021. So we're going to get this stuff out of the way, and we're going to show you what I'm actually going to be building. Now, I've got, for the CPU, an i7 4790K. This is the fastest CPU in 2014, and it still holds up quite remarkably well in 2021. It's 4 cores, 8 threads. You can overclock the snot out of it and get it to beat a Ryzen 5 2600 in gaming. I know, it's insane, right? It's like 4 years newer and it beats it. And it's a very good CPU, and you can find them for relatively cheap. For the graphics card, we're going to be going with a Titan. The original Titan, because it's the only one that I can afford, but a Titan nonetheless because, you know, everyone's got to use a Titan. All the tech tubers got a Titan. So I'm going to be using a Titan. For our motherboard, we're going to be using a Gigabyte Gaming Z97 motherboard. It's a LGA 1150 socket motherboard that fits the CPU and lets it overclock quite well. For the RAM, we're going to be using 16 gigabytes of DDR3 Corsair Vengeance in this nice shiny red color to match with our motherboard, as well as our red Deepcool fans that I got on Amazon. We're going to be using a Deepcool Matrix PC case. Now for our SSD, I'm going to be using a Kingston 240GB because, to be quite honest with you, any SSD that you get, as long as it's got a DRAM cache, which is any reputable SSD brand will have one of those, it's going to be fine for what you need. It's going to be way faster than a hard drive, which is all an SSD needs to be, and way more reliable. I'm not going to be using a hard drive in this build because I'm likely going to be selling it to a friend of mine, and so he's already got a hard drive that he's going to put in this thing. For our power supply, I'm going to be using an EVGA 750 watt, just because it's one I had lying around, and it's more than capable of powering the graphics card that's in here, as well as the CPU. And I'm just going to be using the Intel stock cooler right now, because it's the only cooler that I have on hand, to be quite honest with you. A lot of my coolers appear to be missing the brackets in a box somewhere. I have no clue where it is, so we're just going to use the stock cooler and YOLO it, because that's what I've got on hand. Now, the parts that I'm using in this are probably going to be different than the parts that you are using, but that's fine because the concept of how everything goes together is pretty much the same from PC to PC, no matter what parts you're using. There might be a few slight differences on what you need to connect and where you need to connect it, but it's generally all the same for what I'm doing here. So it should be fine for all of you out there, no matter what you're using. Unless you're using some wonky OEM parts, in which case this build will not cover that because they're weird. They're odd and proprietary, and if you need help with that, just go in the Discord again, and one of us can help you if you have any questions about that. But the video will at least cover the general gist of how everything goes together, and you should be able to follow it step by step and get your PC working on the first try. Now we're just going to move on to the tools that you need to build the PC, and then we're going to get started on this build process. Now, before we start the build process, you're going to want to make sure that you have a few things on hand. So start out with, you're going to want at least 2 different screwdrivers, one with a Phillips head 0 and one with a Phillips head 1. Or you can just buy one of these multi-kit tools if that's a bit too complicated. They usually have all the different sizes that you'll need for a PC build like this. Next, you're going to need some sort of cable ties. You can either use these Velcro ties, you can use zip ties, you can use rubber bands even, and you can also use twist ties like you have on bread. You're also going to want thermal paste because, let's face it, it's your first time building, everyone makes mistakes, and odds are you will end up smearing some of the thermal paste, not getting your cooler on right, and the pre-applied thermal paste will not make enough contact. So having some spare thermal paste on hand is always a good idea. Along with that, having some alcohol wipes. These are 70%. Usually 70% or better alcohol wipes are good. Or you can just use a paper towel and some isopropyl alcohol. These are going to be useful in case you need to clean off something from the board like thermal paste that got everywhere or something along those lines. That way the alcohol will evaporate relatively quickly and will not damage your components at all. Optionally, you can get a pair of vice grips or pliers because sometimes motherboard standoffs will be annoying and you'll need something to twist them out without hurting your fingers and making them bleed. So having one of these to just grip onto them and twist them is really handy. And finally, a requirement is some way of discharging yourself from static electricity. Now there are 2 different ways you can do it. One is to get an anti-static wristband that you can put on your ankle or your wrist. Make sure it has some way to connect to ground so that way you don't make any static discharge. Static discharge is not something that you want to mess with, so it's a good idea to have some sort of way to discharge yourself because there is a slight chance that you will damage your components if there's a static shock that happens to them by touching them. Now lastly, we're going to want a way to ground ourselves. Now by that I mean static discharge builds up whenever you have friction between like cloth on cloth and just walking around. So you want to make sure that any electricity that builds up is going to be discharged away from the sensitive components and into the ground so that they can't damage anything. So there are 2 ways to do this. You can either get an anti-static wristband, make sure it has something that connects to the wall or to a piece of metal or ground that connects back to the wall socket. Alternatively, you can just use your power supply, making sure that you have it plugged in to the wall, and all you have to do is just touch the casing of the power supply every so often, and that will be enough to ground yourself to the wall and make sure that no static discharge happens. Now, I rarely use any of these methods myself personally because I have not had any incidents so far with static electricity, but it's better to be safe than sorry for you guys, especially if it's your first time, and especially if you have cats or dogs or animals in your house. It's a very good idea to keep grounding yourself. So if you're using the power supply method, just keep tapping your hand on the power supply when it's plugged in every once in a while, and that'll ground yourself to the wall. So the first step to building a PC is to build a little test bench outside of the case so that you don't have to redo all your cable management and everything if something shows up dead on arrival. So we're going to start with the motherboard. You always start with the motherboard when building a PC. First, we're going to take the motherboard out of the box. We're then going to set the motherboard on top of the motherboard box. This motherboard box will then be used as our test bench, and we're going to hook up everything to it and use the box as our little case for now. Now we're going to start with an AMD CPU installation guide, because that is what most people are buying for gaming nowadays. There will also be an Intel CPU installation guide right after the AMD one, so just skip ahead if you have Intel. The first step to installing your AMD CPU is to get it out of the box, or out of whatever container you're holding it in. If you didn't get it in a box, you got it used, you're then going to open it and release it from its package. Now, while you're handling the CPU, you don't want to touch any of these pins. It's not a huge deal if you do, but these pins are really small and very fragile, and they can and will bend if you put enough force on them, or even break off in a worst case scenario. So make sure that when you're handling the CPU, you are handling it by the sides, like so. So you're going to open it up from the packaging with the Ryzen logo facing upwards. That way, when you open it up, the CPU does not fall out. Alternatively, you can also open it up with the Ryzen logo down. However, you never ever want to open it up sideways, otherwise the CPU will just drop out of the package and land onto the board. Make sure, however, when you're opening it up, that you're opening up very close to the motherboard or whatever surface that you are opening it over. That way, if it does fall somehow, it has a much less likely chance of breaking. We're going to open up the package, and we're going to pick up our CPU by the sides. Now we have our little lever down here. Now as you can see, there is a tiny little arrow right here, and on the CPU there's also going to be a tiny little golden arrow. And what you're going to do is you're going to take the CPU and you're going to match it up where the arrow lines up. You're going to then gently drop it in. You should not need to press on it. It doesn't need any force to go into the socket. It should just use gravity to go down. And lock it back into place. And then you can try and give it a little wiggle, and if it moves around, or if this lever has a bit of resistance when you're pulling it down, then that means that it is not installed correctly and you may need to rotate it. But if your CPU is firmly in place, then you should be good to go. And then you pull down the lever to installing your RAM and your cooler. Now we're going to move on to the Intel CPU. So, if you're installing an Intel CPU into an Intel motherboard like this, first of all, you're going to see this little cover here that is covering the socket. Now, you can take this cover off beforehand, but I highly recommend that you leave it on there because you want to leave the CPU pins exposed for as little time as possible to prevent things like dust and hair from getting caught in there. So the first thing that we're going to do is lift this little lever and push to the side, and then we will pull the lever back, and up with it will come this CPU bracket and cover. Now, the pins are exposed here. Do not touch any of the pins or put anything in them because this can, in fact, cause interruptions in the connection with the CPU and, at best, make it not be detected in the motherboard, and at worst, could bend or break pins if something gets in there or if you touch it, and your motherboard would not only be broken, but the manufacturer will not accept the warranty for it because the pins are bent or broken. No motherboard manufacturer that I'm aware of will accept an RMA on a motherboard that has bent or broken pins. So be very careful around these delicate little pins. Now, for your Intel CPU, there are two ways to tell which direction to put it in because it is a square. First way you can do it, most modern motherboards will have this option, is that there will be a little triangle that you'll be able to match with a little triangle notch on the CPU socket. Now, because this is a slightly older motherboard, there is not a clearly marked triangle here. It is a bit hard to see. I have enough experience to tell, but most people may not be able to see that. So, the alternative way of doing it is there will be two little notches in the CPU and two little notches in the CPU socket, here and here. So, what we're going to do is line up those notches with the CPU. We're going to hold the CPU by the sides and not touching the contact points or the IHS, this little metal bit here. Although you can touch this, just don't touch the bottom gold contact pins because any smudge in there could make your CPU not be detected. And we are going to gently place the CPU into the socket like so. Start by dropping it in gently and it'll install just like that. And then we're going to simply put this down, pull the lever back, push it back forward again. Our little cover will pop off, and we're going to firmly pull the lever aside and tuck it back under this thing. Now, this little cover, very important. You're going to want to hold on to this cover in the event that your motherboard does not turn on or something happens to it. Maybe the BIOS gets corrupted or a BIOS update goes bad or something that is covered under warranty. Because if you send in an Intel motherboard without this cover, they will not accept it for RMA or warranty. No motherboard manufacturer that I know of will accept this board without this cover. So, in order to reinstall the cover without the CPU, all you have to do is be careful around these pins, is to put these two little back notches on here where the hinge is for the CPU retention mechanism, and then you're going to push these two little clips into place. It should snap into place, and your motherboard will be recovered and is now ready to be put back in the box to be resold or to be RMA'd back to the manufacturer. Now we're going to move on to installing the CPU cooler. Now, because I am actually very short on coolers at the moment, we are just going to use the Intel stock cooler for today. I'm not Linus Tech Tips. I don't have every single cooler available to man. I just have the Intel stock cooler available at the moment. So for most of you, you guys are going to need to go and look up an installation tutorial video on how to install your specific cooler or read the manual, because each cooler is different. There are so many different mounting mechanisms that it could take a 20-minute video to show how to install every different type of cooler. I could be here for hours trying to film that. So instead, I'm just going to show you how to do the one, and you guys just have to look up your own cooler because it'll be more efficient and it'll be better for you guys so you can get more accurate information on your exact cooler. Now, before we install the CPU cooler, if it doesn't already have some applied, we need to put on some thermal paste. Now, this is where everyone in the comments is going to roast me and say that I did thermal paste wrong, because this is one of the most highly debated topics on the internet for no reason whatsoever. As long as you have enough thermal paste on there, it is going to be fine and it is going to cool well. So my method of doing it is you take your thermal paste, you remove the cap, and then you push the plunger in, and you only do a little tiny pee on the CPU. That is more than enough there. And what will happen is when you apply the CPU cooler, it is going to spread out on top of the metal IHS plate on here, and it'll give plenty enough contact with the CPU heatsink and cold plate on the bottom here. Now, it is going to be a bit different if you're using Threadripper sockets, so there are diagrams that Gamers Nexus has that you can look to how to apply thermal paste there, but if you're using a standard sized AMD or Intel CPU, this is the way to do it that I recommend. And next we're going to put on our Intel stock cooler. So these can be a little bit finicky, so if you see me struggling in the video, don't worry, literally everyone does this because these coolers are a bit dinky and a bit weird, but it is what Intel gives you. So we're going to put the cooler on top, and we're going to line up with the 4 holes. For AMD, you may have a lever mechanism for their stock cooler. We're going to twist these to the position that'll let us push it in, and we're going to push until we hear a click, or until we feel it lock, and turning it over, like so, will make it so that we cannot pull up on it. And for most CPU coolers, whether you have this dinky mechanism or you have a screw in, it is best to go corner to corner and then corner to corner. That way you get even mounting pressure and it's easier to place them in. So we're going to flip it around like so. Hear that snap in, and we're going to turn it. Oh, I turned it the wrong way. These coolers are a bit of a pain. The best way to tell if it's locked in is you'll see for the stock cooler is that these little wedges will be pushed open by this little black pin inside. See, these ones that are not installed are not wedged open, whereas the ones that we have installed are going to be wedged open like this. So we've got 2 of them down, and we have 2 more to go. So we are going to push it in, twist it, lock it in. That's the wrong way. Intel, note for me, push it in, lock it in. Note for me, Intel, make these coolers much better and much easier to install, because this is so cheaply made, and it is honestly like a sin. So next we are just going to simply plug in our fan header into the correct one, the CPU fan header, and there you go. You've installed your Intel stock cooler. And like I said, if you need to figure out how to install your own cooler, I highly recommend just looking on YouTube for another tutorial, because that's going to be way more accurate than anything that I could do on this channel right now. And let's move on. So now that we've installed the CPU, we're going to install RAM. Now when installing RAM, you're going to notice these little clips here that hold the RAM in place. You're going to open those up, and we're going to install the RAM in a certain order. Now, some motherboards will have instructions on the board for which slot to put the RAM in first. This one does not. But as a general rule, you're going to want to start by installing in slots 2 and 4 from the CPU. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Your board will probably have them labeled differently, but I like to call these 1, 2, 3, and 4 just to make things easier. So we're going to install in slots 2 and 4 with our RAM. You start out by lining up this little notch on the RAM with the notch on the motherboard. You will then stick the 2 sides inside of the little collapsing mechanism. In these little grooves, you're going to stick the RAM slot in, and then you're going to take your thumbs and push firmly until you hear a click, and these little levers are going to lock in to the RAM and snap into place automatically. That is how you know that your RAM has a good fit. So you start with slot 2. Now we're going to move to slot 4. We're going to put it inside of the 2 little grooves. Going to push down with your thumbs, and then your RAM is installed. Now, the reason why you want to install this RAM in a certain way is because there are different channels in RAM, and you want to make sure that you're running in dual channel mode to get the best performance. Dual channel basically means that these 2 sticks are in the same channel, so therefore there is less latency between the CPU and the RAM, so they're able to talk to each other faster, therefore giving you better performance. If you have your RAM installed into 2 different channels, then what the CPU has to do is it then has to send a message to 1 and then send a message to 2, and it is much more inefficient. So you want to make sure that your RAM is running in dual channel. If you have 4 RAM sticks that are exactly the same, then you don't really need to worry about it. But if you have 1 or 2 sticks, then you need to make sure that they are in the proper channels. You always start with slot number 2, or you check your manual for your motherboard or look on the board, and it should tell you which slot to install the RAM in first. Always double check that to make sure that you get the best performance, especially if you're running Ryzen or newer Intel CPUs. Now, next we are going to install our M.2 SSD. They're the little gumstick-shaped SSDs like this, not the big rectangular ones. And how we're going to install this is, first you have to make sure that it is the right key, because there are different types of M.2 slots that have different type of keys. The keys are where these little notches are placed. So there is a guide that will be on screen to show you the different keys, but assuming that you have the right key for the right slot, you're going to start by putting the SSD into the slot at an angle like so, and then it will fit in like that. And then it is very important, because sometimes motherboards will not have the little standoffs installed, is that you do not screw it down directly to the board like this. This will either, 1, make it so that your SSD will not read half the time, or 2, might even break the connection in the long term. I have actually done this before, so I know this is something that you're not supposed to do. So you need to make sure that you have this little tiny standoff screw that you put into the little hole here and that you screw in before you put in the tiny screw to hold that in place. Do not screw it directly down to the motherboard PCB. That is bad. So you screw in your standoff, make sure that you get your big screwdriver. And now this is the main reason why you need that little teeny tiny number 0 sized screwdriver, is because the little teeny tiny M.2 SSD screw will not work with your big screwdriver. You're gonna put it in again at an angle, put it down. It helps to have a magnetized one or just to have tiny fingers. I'm gonna put the screw in, and then you are just going to gently screw the little screw into the standoff. And there you go. Your M.2 SSD should be flat with the PCB at like a parallel degree. It should not be meeting the PCB directly at an angle. It should be flat like this. An important thing to keep in mind is that some M.2 SSDs are going to be different gens of PCIe, which means they will run at different speeds. You want to make sure that your M.2 slot has a Gen 4 lane with your Gen 4 SSD if you have one. If you have a Gen 3 SSD and no Gen 4, then it can go in any slot that you wish, but make sure that you have that Gen 4, that it will go into the Gen 4 slot. This mostly applies for AMD B550 motherboards, but could apply for future motherboards that come out this year. The last thing that we have to do in order to make sure that our PC parts are working is to plug in the power supply into the PC. So first we are going to start with the big boy, the what is called ATX power, and you are just going to plug it in here. Each of these little connectors will have these clips on them, and that will correspond to a little notch on the edge here, so you know which way you're supposed to put it in, so that you don't short anything out. So we're going to plug that in first. It's going to hang over the CPU fan, but that's fine because we're not putting it in the case yet. This is just to make sure that everything that we have is working. So just going to gently push that in. Next, we are going to put in the CPU power connectors. Those will go up here, up on top. This one is a bit different, so I have to put them in backwards from how they normally do. A lot of them have the little tab on the bottom from the ones that I've built in. And then the final step is to install the graphics card. So you're going to line up the slot, the PCIe slot here, with the top PCIe slot here, because the top one is going to give you the most bandwidth and give you the most performance when you are running your card. So you're just going to gently line up with the slot, and if you have a locking tab on the end, you're going to lower that down. You are going to then gently push the card into the slot, like so. Now, if you are running an Intel motherboard, you don't have to put the graphics card in yet, but I always like to do it anyways, just to make sure that the card works and that the PCIe slot works. And then, because this card is a very powerful card, we are going to need to connect our PCIe connectors. A lot of the lower end cards like the GTX 1050 will sometimes not have these connectors, but most high-end to mid-range cards are going to require these connectors. These, like the 24-pin connector that we plugged in here, the ATX connector, have breakaway cables for most power supplies, so you can either have them as 6 pins or 8 pins, and you just need to clip it together and you will turn it into a 8 pin. So we're going to start with the 6 pin here. This will become more important later on when we are doing our cable management to figure out which one should go where, to make the runs for the cables look the cleanest and to have our build look the nicest. But just to get something that is going to be functional, this one is actually a bit tricky. Just to get something a bit functional, it doesn't really matter how it looks right now. We just need to make sure that the PC will turn on. And so our GPU is connected, our 24 pin is connected, our CPU power is connected, and now all we have to do is to jump start it, hook up a monitor, and make sure that it powers on. Make sure that your cables are all the way clicked in when you're installing them to make sure that they get proper contact and so that your system will boot. First, make sure to switch on your power supply. Line means on, and that it is feeding power to the rest of your system. It's also a good idea to make sure that the fan is up so the power supply can get proper airflow and cooling. The last thing to do before booting up your system is to plug in the cables so that it will display an output. So, first we're going to install our keyboard and mouse into the USB ports here, and my little mouse dongle will go here. Doesn't really matter which USB ports you plug them into. If you are still using PS2 keyboard and mouse, then plug them into the PS2 keyboard and mouse sockets before you turn on the PC, otherwise it will not boot, but that only really applies for really old systems. By will not boot, I mean it will not boot and recognize the mouse and keyboard, because PS2 does not hot swap like you can with USB. So, the last thing we're going to do is plug in our video output. So, it's very important if you are using a graphics card to plug it into the graphics card. If you're using the motherboard, that is when you plug it into the motherboard. If you plug it into the motherboard while you have a graphics card, it probably will not show any display output, or what some modern boards will do is tell you, hey, plug it into the graphics card because it's detected a graphics card in it. So, we're going to plug it into our GTX Titan here, and we are ready to power her on. Now some modern motherboards, a lot of modern motherboards and high-end boards will have a dedicated power on switch or button built into the board in case you are testing it outside of the case. In our circumstance, we do not have one of those. So what you're going to do is you're going to find the 2 pins on the motherboard that are marked power. So there's power plus and power minus. And with your screwdriver, because it's conductive, we are going to just simply poke these 2 pins and short the connection. And just like that, our PC is going to turn on and should boot right up into the BIOS. When you are booting up your PC, you are going to want to spam either the delete key, the F8 key, the F2 key, or whichever one that your motherboard will prompt you to press in order to get into the BIOS. You want to press this before it fully boots up, because otherwise you will have to restart the computer to try it again. So we're going to jump our 2 pins on the motherboard, and we are going to spam the delete key, and that'll bring us into the BIOS. Now the BIOS is basically the motherboard's own little operating system that lets the components talk to each other, and it lets you adjust how things will boot or your overclocking. It's basically just the built-in motherboard OS. Now your BIOS is probably going to look a lot different than mine because every single board uses its own sort of BIOS. Some of you, if you're running older boards or lower-end boards, will have something that kind of looks like it's from the 1990s, and you'll only be able to move around with the arrow keys on your keyboard. If you have a more fancy one or newer one like mine, then you'll still be able to use your mouse and you'll have fancy little pictures to click on, like this. We're going to mess around a bit more with the BIOS later, but what's important now is that we are inside of the BIOS, and that means that our computer has successfully booted. Now the next step is for us to take apart this computer and to put it inside of the case and build it proper this time. Now the first thing to do before unplugging all of your components is to make sure that the power supply is switched off, so that way you don't, on the offhand chance, short anything that has live power going through it. Now we're going to put our motherboard into the case. So we're going to start by unplugging our cables from the board. We are going to remove the pins from the graphics card. the 8-pin and the 6-pin in our case, not the actual pins for like SLI or for the PCIe lane. We'll push down the lever on the PCIe slot and pull the graphics card out gently. We'll then unplug the 8-pin connector. And lastly, the 24-pin connector. And because I had a SATA drive connected, a SATA connector will need to be also unplugged in my case. And now your motherboard will be loose again. Now we're at the really fun part. We are going to unbox the case and set it up on the table. Well, that broke. Come on, get out there. Get there. Out of here. That's not good. Everything's falling apart. And so this is the case that we will be using for our build today. It is the Deepcool Matrix 50. It's an ATX case. It's got a nice glass side panel and front panel, and it is going to be perfect for our build. Start by removing the side panel. On ours, we are going to unscrew these 4 little screws holding it in. Be very careful with the glass, because the glass is glass and glass breaks. Now gently put the glass panel aside where it will not get broken, because once again, it is glass, and glass is glass, glass breaks. Now our case also has a back panel that is removable, as 99% of PC cases do have. So we're going to unscrew those 2 thumb screws and just slide the back panel off. Some cases will have a removable front panel that you can also access by removing the 2 side panels. We will get to that in a second though, because now we're going to access our handy dandy little bag of screws and accessories for the case. Now the next step is to get your front panel off of the case. Now if you're someone like me and is building a budget rig for this build, it's going to take you a while, because they use these really cheap and annoying little clamps here that you have to reach your fingers into and squeeze. My advice is that if you have a case like this, you get yourself something like a butter knife to wedge in between as you squeeze it to help pop it off a lot easier. There we go. What the hell? There's like a loose... There's just a loose thumb screw in here. Another tech tip, don't buy dirt cheap cases off of Amazon, and get yourself one that I have linked below for a better case than this. There were 2 screws loose in this. They were both for the hard drive bay. The screw just wasn't screwed in. Now it's time to install the motherboard. So first we're going to take the AIO shield that came with the motherboard, and we are going to put it inside of the case. Just push it through until it pops into place. And there you go. Next, we are going to install the motherboard into the case. So you're going to notice that in the case, you're going to have these little screws that are called standoffs. Now these are screws that can put a screw inside of them. They basically hold the board off of the tray to keep the board from making any contacts and maybe shorting out. So it's important that you don't just screw it into the case unless you're dealing with an OEM case that has like built-in weird standoff things. There'll be a picture on the screen of what one of those looks like. But we're going to put these standoffs in. Usually cases will have them installed, some of them will not. If you have a different size motherboard than what is already laid out with your standoffs, like the one that I have right now, then you can easily use a pair of vice grips to grip onto them and unscrew them, because they're going to be a little bit too tight for you to use your fingers to unscrew. So we're going to move this one aside here, and to remove them with your vice grips, you're just going to take them, you're going to clamp them on to the screw head, and you're going to twist, and you should just need to turn it a little bit before your hand will be able to do the rest. Now, you need to make sure that you have standoffs for all of the holes in your motherboard, so that way when you go to screw it in, you can have it as secure as possible. So, after you've got your standoffs installed, we're going to take our board. If it has a smaller air cooler like this, I usually pick it up by the cooler. If it has a water cooler or got a really big and bulky Noctua cooler, then I will hold it by the sides. And we're just gonna take it. We are going to line it up with the back of the IO shield, so that way all of our little connection ports on the back are going to be filled up with the IO of the board. Now, some of you, in your cases, will have a standoff that has a little peg in it that will allow you to put it through one of the holes and mount the motherboard in place. But because ours is a slightly older case and is also a bit cheaper, we do not have one of those. So instead, you're gonna have to apply a little bit of pressure to line up the screw hole with the standoff. And I'm gonna start with the center one. I usually start off with the center one because usually just that one screw is enough to hold the board in by itself. Sometimes it's a little tricky to line up. There we go. We're gonna just gently screw that in. And now, as you can see, the board is now mounted there. Now, I usually like to just start with the one screw because sometimes for routing things like your all-in-one liquid cooler, you will have these special cables that you'll need to route, say, behind the motherboard. And so leaving a bit of gap will allow you to just pull the motherboard up just enough to get the header through there. But because we're not really dealing with that in this case, I'm going to go ahead and screw in the rest of these screws for the board. Now, like I said, there's not going to be a lot of coverage on specific coolers in this video, but there are 3 different ways that you can install an AIO cooler inside of a case. Depending on how many fans you have, you can either do a pull configuration, a push configuration, or a push-pull configuration. Like I said, this depends on your case and how many fans you have. In order to do a pull configuration, you would simply take the long screws included with your AIO and put them through where the tubes come out. So the tubes are going to be facing down and inside of the case and going inwards. And for a pull configuration, you're going to put your long screws here, and then you're going to have a set of short screws that'll go on the front and attach it to the case like so. For a push configuration, it is going to be much easier. There are 2 ways to do a push configuration. You can either, so there are 2 ways you can do a push configuration. You can have the fan and the radiator sandwiching the bracket on the case, or if you don't have a lot of airflow on the front, or not enough space to put a fan in front of the bracket, you can instead mount the fan directly to the radiator and then put the screw through the fan into the radiator. Finally, there is push-pull, which is a hybrid of the 2. You just do a pull configuration on the back, and then on the front, you either do the sandwich method where the case is in the center, or where the fan is in the center. It all really depends on the spacing and the airflow. I will have a couple of cases linked down below that I recommend that you get that can be used for either push-pull or just for push or for pull. Push-pull isn't really a thing to consider unless you are using all custom RGB fans and you have enough to put on the front and back. Otherwise, if you have a see-through front, I recommend that you do a push configuration because then you can see the fans on the front. And if you are using a case like an NZXT case where the front is closed off, then I recommend that you do a pull configuration because then your fans are not going to be getting enough airflow on the front, and you also wouldn't be able to see them there anyways, so you might as well have the RGB and everything on the inside. So, like I said, look up the manual or an instruction video on your own AIO, but those are the 3 different ways that you can install the radiator to the case. Now, when installing your CPU AIO cooler, you're going to want to make sure that you have the correct bracket installed for either Intel or AMD. Usually AMD will come with these little hooks that will hook onto the hooks that come with your motherboard. And so we are just going to hook it on here. We're going to hook on the smaller hook on the bottom. And then we're going to simply screw it on. Now, if you have a case that already has the fans all installed for you, then great, skip past this part. But if you've bought your own kit of fans like I have, and you want to attach them to the case, then the first thing you're going to need to do is to take these screws that come included with the case or with the fans, and you're going to want to screw those into the fans before you screw the fans into the case. That is because these fans are not pre-drilled out for the screws, so you have to tap them yourself. You're going to need to apply a bit of pressure when screwing them in, but you just screw them all the way in, and they will automatically tap themselves. And then you're going to want to do this for all of your fans before installing them into the case. Now you're going to mount the fans to the case. So I'm doing it this way with my case because it'll work this way. I am lining them up by setting the fans down on the table and then matching the holes of the case to the holes of the fans. In other cases, you may just have to hold the fans up to the brackets with the case upright and then screw them in that way. But I find this way to be a little bit easier. So you're just going to put the screws into the rolls that you tapped, and you're just going to screw them in. If you're doing a multiple fan array like I am doing, then I recommend that you leave them a little bit loose so you can slide the fans around to make them match up and not have any gaps in them, to make it look a little bit cleaner. Now, we're going to thread the cables for these fans through these holes in the case. If your case does not have holes like this, then install your fans on the inside. My case does, so we're going to pull the cables through for each of these fans. This one is going to have to share this one. And a little tech tip for you guys is that you can actually save these twist ties and reuse them on the loops in the case that you guys have, and reuse them to cable manage your fan cables. Now, the way that I like to cable manage things is I usually like to start with the smaller cables first and then work my way up to the larger cables like the power supply cables. So we're going to start with a small cable like these fan headers. Start by plugging in the fan header to the board here. And we're going to tuck this Molex connector away. You can always just cut those Molex connectors off if you have them included with your case. If you're not going to use Molex, most people never use Molex. I sometimes use them for when I'm using like really old OEM builds and retro builds. So I'm going to keep it on for this one. But you can always just cut this little cable off and you'll be just fine. So in managing your cables, it's a good idea to first figure out where you need to plug into before you route the cables through the holes. So we're going to start with our fans that are on the front here, and our fan headers on the motherboard are here, and we have one more up top here. So we're going to route one of them through this hole, one of them through this hole, and one of them through this hole. There's one. There's two. There's three. And for the final fan header up here, we're just going to route it through and stick it up into this fan header that is on the board. This one is a 3-pin going to a 4-pin, but that's just fine. The 4th pin is just for more expensive and fancier fans that use a bit more control over them and have a bit more RPM adjustments. But I'm just using cheapo fans, so that will do the job just fine. Now, in cable management, you'll find many times that you're not going to be able to reach where you want to go. So you got to look for alternative routes. Like, for example, this case intends for you to move the fan header through this hole through the front to get it to the back to hook up to the board. The problem is that none of these cables are long enough to reach that back header on the motherboard. But if we remove the cable for the bottom fan from back here, and instead of putting it through the intended hole, we slide it underneath, we then have enough reach to turn the system around, and we have just enough reach to hook up our fan to the fan header. So sometimes with cable management, you're going to have to get creative like that and find alternative routes to what may be intended, but just make sure that your cables are able to reach. Now, because this is a beginner's guide, there's a good chance that a lot of you are not going to be using cable extensions, so just find whichever route is the one that will get the cable to the intended port with as little of the cable showing as possible. As you can see here, this fan header is plugged in, but it is showing a hell of a lot of cable outside of the motherboard that, sure, the graphics card might block out, but there's a much easier way to do it, which is instead of routing it through here, you just route it through the bottom, so you have way less cable showing. As you can see, the cables are nice and neatly tucked away, and there is no cable stretching across your board. Makes it look a bit cleaner, a bit nicer, and gives it a much better aesthetic. Also, in a lot of airflow restricted cases, it will help a little bit with that. It's not a huge benefit to airflow, but if you have a glass side panel, if you have a big spaghetti mess of cables, then people are going to notice that and they're going to make fun of you on Reddit. So make sure that you do some nice cable management. It doesn't take too long, honestly. to just route your cables around, and I'm going to show you the other ways that you can do that. So next, we're going to route our front panel headers for our case, and we're going to untie these. You can always reuse these ties that come with the case, or many cases will come with zip ties. As I said in the beginning, you should probably have your own zip ties or cable ties ready so that you can tie them down and cinch down the cables to make this less of a mess and a hassle to deal with later on. So we're going to take our cables, and we're going to start with the USB-C or USB 3.0 connector right here, and we are just going to simply route that through this hole, and we are just going to simply plug it in to our header. Now this does have a notch here, which will line up with a notch right here on the side, and we'll line it up like so. Be careful with these connectors, because USB 3.0 connectors do have a tendency of being hard to remove and can sometimes break the pins when you try to remove them. I've got a friend who did that, and it was not a very pretty experience. So make sure that you've got your USB connector in right, and that you don't need to plug it in and out a whole bunch, because that could break the pin. So try and do it in the first try. Now all this loose dangly cable business we will deal with in a minute, but we're going to work on the rest of the front headers first before we deal with that. As you can see, the power button and reset button pins are right here. There will usually be a pinout diagram either on the board or in your manual. I'm just going to use the pinout diagram on the board and get in real close and do it this way. I would recommend that you lay the PC down on its side to do it, but I'm going to do it upright just like this. We're going to take these little pins here and shove them through the hole in the bottom of the case, just like so. And again, don't worry about the extra cabling that you have now, because we're going to come back later and tighten it up a bit and make it nice and clean. Now we're going to plug in our cables. So as you can see on the board, there are little teeny tiny indicators that will tell you where each pin goes where, and we're going to use those to plug in each of these little teeny tiny cables into the board. You guys probably won't be able to see this very well on camera because these are really teeny tiny, but I'm going to put the reset switch here, and don't worry about which direction you put these in. Most of the time I've noticed that these will work bi-directionally, so if you have them plugged in like this or like this, they will work just fine. We're going to plug in the hard drive LED. Some motherboards and cases nowadays will come with a combo connection because it has become mostly standardized for the front panel. We're going to plug in the power switch next, like so. And then finally we're going to plug in the two power LED connections, and those will go in just like that. And now you've got all of your front panel connectors all plugged in, so your power switch will work in everything. Now we're going to pull these cables through a bit, but not enough to unplug them, just enough to sort of get them out of the way up front here, and we'll move them to the side for now. Next is our USB and audio headers, so we are just going to tuck those underneath and up to the front of the board. And once again, you're going to notice that all of these little cables and headers on the board are going to have little tiny labels on them that are going to tell you which ones they are and what they plug into. As you'll see, this is our HD audio header on the board. It'll say it right here. And we have our HD audio cable. That is going to say that right there. And we are just going to plug it in to the correct spot. This is our HD audio cable, and we're going to plug that into our HD audio port. And you can tell which way it plugs in because you'll see one of the pins is missing here, and one of the pins will be missing on the board. So you'll see that missing pin, and you will plug it in nice and tight, like so. The same thing goes for our USB headers. We're just going to take our USB cable, and we're going to plug it in where there is not a pin. Right here, there's not a pin, and as you can see on the cable, it's missing a pin. And that's how you'll know if it's upright. You don't want to try and force it in the other direction, because otherwise you'll end up bending one of the pins, and your USB will very likely not work or work at full capacity. These take a little bit of wiggling and jamming to get in, but that's in, and that is in. We have our front panel headers plugged in, and we are now ready to move on to the power supply cables. First, we're going to push our front panel connector cables through these holes to make them look nice and clean. Same goes with these little teeny tiny front panel cables and button connectors here. We're just going to push all these cables through to the other side because we want to make these look as neat as possible. That way, when you put in your graphics card, it is very low chance that you will see this, and it will barely stand out at all. Unfortunately, there really isn't much we can do with the USB 3.0 header, other than just sort of tuck it in as best we can back here, because it is in a very awkward angle. A lot of boards nowadays are coming with right angle connectors, but even that wouldn't really help because there's no direct hole in this case, so you're just going to have to make this look as neat as possible. Your cables are not going to be completely perfect, but you just want to try and get them as neat as possible. Now, for the power supply cables, I always suggest that you start with the cable that is quote-unquote on the top. Now, what that means is that you don't want to start with your PCIe connectors because, as you'll see, it'll be crossing over these cables and it'll make it a bit difficult to cable manage these afterwards. So we're going to start with the CPU cable because that is right now on top of the power supply, and we are going to simply weave our connector through the rest of the cables and around them and all the way up top through this top hole. Move the other cables out of the way and on top of it. Next is going to be our 24-pin ATX power connector, and we're just going to stuff this one through this hole here to reach the motherboard. Next is going to be our 24-pin ATX power connector, and we are just going to stick this one through this top hole here. And we're just going to let these cables dangle here for a minute until we move around to the other side to plug them in. For the time being, we're going to take our SATA and our Molex cables, and we are just going to tuck them underneath to the front area over here. We're just going to do this for now to get them out of the way because we will later come back and we will plug them into the drive bays. Now, depending on your case for the next one, the final bit is going to be our PCIe connectors. And if your case doesn't have a cutout on the bottom of the PSU shroud, then you're going to simply route them through this hole here, and they will go to the graphics card once they're done. Or if your power supply has another hole on the shroud that you can plug your PCIe connectors through, then we are going to route these into the basement and up through that top hole. And we're simply going to pull it up through this hole in the shroud like so, and when we install our graphics card, it will just come up and plug in like so. Now, just like you did before, we're going to take our CPU power connectors and we're going to clip them into the board. And we're also going to do the same thing for our ATX 24-pin connector. We're going to take that and we are going to plug that ATX connector into the socket. And we're going to tuck that cable back in there. Same thing goes with the CPU cable. We're going to tuck that back up in there. And the graphics card connectors we are going to get back to in a little bit. Now we're going to deal with this mess of cables that we have in the back now. So what we're going to do is take these cables and get a little cable tie, twist tie, or zip tie. And we're going to bring them over to this tie point on the board. Bringing it over, we're going to stick the tie through the point. If you are using a twist tie, it's a good idea to make a little loop that you can loop it around a bit, pull it back through. And once you've got it pulled back through, you just take this twist tie or zip tie and you will twist it together. And this will keep these cables nice and tightly cinched down. And it'll give your build an overall cleaner aesthetic. We just need to move on to these bottom cables down here. And then we need to cable manage these and our cable management will be done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these audio cables and USB cables, as well as this CPU power cable, and a couple of these cables down here. We're going to bring them over into a neat little bundle. If you have a cable tie down point, then you're going to put your little zip tie through here. I'm using a zip tie now because I want to show you guys the different ways of doing this. The zip ties are a little bit more annoying to do than twist ties, in my opinion, and they are single-time use, a bit more wasteful, but I can see the appeal because they're a bit more easier to get than a twist tie, so it's really just up to personal preference at that point. We're going to put our zip tie through and tie it around through the cable loop and the rest of the cables, and we're just going to tighten our little zip tie down. Make sure you leave just a little bit of slack in the zip tie in case you need to cut it in the future to move around cables or reinstall things. That way you don't have to get out a knife and possibly cut your cables, damaging anything. We're going to tuck these cables down here. And it's not going to be the cleanest job on the back, but because we're not dealing with anything like a fancy glass back for our case, then it's going to do just fine. We're going to get yet another zip tie, and we're going to stick it through here. If you have trouble putting zip ties through these little cable loops, it is always a good idea to bend them just a little bit to make them come back through. Sometimes you have to convince them. We're going to stick our zip tie here, and we will zip tie these cables together so they will not move. Now for our 24 pin, it is going to be a little bit tricky to cable manage, and depending on what kind of case you have. NZXT has nice cable channelings on the back for their 24 pin connectors, but we don't have anything like that. So what I'm going to do is try and tuck this cable sort of around through the back here, and we're going to try and cable tie it here and here, and then we're going to let this little loose bit on the bottom sort of tuck away into the bottom. Alternatively, we could try and stick the excess down in the basement and then just cable tie these 2 points here, but that would leave a bit of a bulge here, which is going to make it harder to put our back panel on. And we have ourselves a functional PC. Now for the 24 pin, what I'm going to do is, because we don't have a fancy cable channel like NZXT does, I'm going to instead tuck the excess away into the basement. That's always what you should do when in doubt when cable managing and you don't have a place to put things. We're then going to take our included zip ties. We're going to start by cinching this one down, sticking it through the little cable routing hole. This one I am going to be a bit more tighter on, just because 24 pin connector loves to break loose and cause bulging issues with the side panel putting that back on. So I'm going to keep this one tight, but not too tight to the point where we can't cut them if we ever need to move around the 24 pin connector. Something that I've found on cases that have a bit of extra cable management room on the back is that you can get right angle adapters for the 24 pin that will make it look a lot cleaner when you're cable managing it. But for this one, we're going to be fine without one of those. It would just add to our budget, and I think this is going to look just good enough with our zip tie job that we've done. Now we're going to move on to the graphics card. So we're going to start by unscrewing the retention bracket for the graphics card slits right here. It's usually 1 or 2 screws. And that's just going to pull away. And set that aside. Now, depending on your case, you're going to have ones that unscrew. So you simply take your screwdriver and unscrew the screw, and the PCIe cover will just come right off. In cheaper cases, like the one I have here, you are going to have breakaway PCIe covers. So you're just going to take them and twist them a bit, and they should just break right off. Make sure if your case has these and you don't have any spare covers lying around that you only take off the ones that you're going to need. Otherwise, you're going to have a bit of an ugly gap here that is going to allow more dust to come inside the case. We're also going to need to remove this one. To reinstall these covers, all you need to do is put the cover back in. These covers will usually have a handy little notch in them that will lock into the outside. You're going to take your screw, stick it in, and simply tighten until the connector is fully popped in. And now we have our 2 slots ready for our graphics card. To install the graphics card, you're going to take it and align it with the slot. Make sure that you move any cables out of the way. You'll line up with the slot, and this bracket will line up here. And then you're simply going to press it into the slot until this little connection here will pop the graphics card into place, just like you did on the test bench. You're then going to take your PCIe power connections, and you're going to simply plug them in to the card. Now these are really difficult to make look nice because they have these really weird bends in them, unless you have a modular power supply that will have a dedicated cable for each of these connections. So you're just going to have to live with a bit of a bend here. EVGA does make something called the Power Link. That is a right angle adapter that would allow you to feed the cables through one of these holes here and make it look a lot cleaner. But for now, this is what we're going to have to do, and we're going to take the rest of the cable and just tuck it underneath through here like so. Finally, we're going to take our larger anchoring screws. They're kind of going to look like the similar ones for the power supply. We are going to stick them in and screw them in. And now your graphics card will be nice and securely tightened down and ready to game. Finally, we're going to take our retention plate and we are going to reinstall it. We're going to take the screw and then we are just going to screw it in. We're going to move on to the glass panels. So what I'm going to do is take an alcohol wipe and wipe the glass of these panels on the inside, because There's a good chance that there are fingerprint smudges on there, and we don't want that. We want it to be nice and clear. We are then going to take our front panel and pop it back into place. Now we're going to go and plug in our PC and see if it turns on. Take our power cable, plug it in, make sure that it's switched on. Make sure your Windows installation disk or Linux installation disk is plugged into the PC before you go into the BIOS. Now we're going to get into the BIOS. Once again, spam the delete key or the F2 key to get in. And when you're in the BIOS, all you need to do is adjust your RAM and make sure that your boot settings are all in order. You usually have to go to advanced mode, and you're going to want to go to your overclocking tab, or in my case, AI tweaker. If you're using Intel, then your RAM overclocking is going to be called XMP. If you're using AMD, then your RAM overclocking is going to be called DOCP. And you're going to want to select that. And you should have a profile. With most boards, it's just a one-click button. Mine's a bit more finicky, so I have to go down to this drop-down menu and select it. Then we're going to go into the boot, and you're going to want to select your Windows USB drive, and select that as boot option 1. And boot option 2 is going to be your SSD that you have installed. Once you've done that, you can go and exit the BIOS by hitting escape, or by going to the exit and saving your changes. And then it should boot you up into the Windows installation tool, which you will just need to follow through the instructions to install Windows, and then your PC will be ready to game. All you'll have to do is install the drivers when you're in Windows, install all of your programs and everything, and your PC will be set to go. And voila. So congratulations on building your first gaming PC. Thank you for choosing my guide to be the one to teach you how to build your PC. If you like this guide, make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe to see more content that's coming up, like seeing how well this MacBook Pro from 2006 will last in 2021. It's honestly going to surprise you, so I would stick around for that video coming out in a little bit. If you want to see me stream, my stream will also be down below in the description for my Twitch, as well as all the other socials down there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. If you feel like you're getting stressed, or, think